Christmas is not supposed to come except on December 25th, but it really felt like a celebratory event when suddenly Gail and Oprah were approaching me at the South entrance.
This is Life's Tough, Explorers Are Tougher, and I'm your host, Richard Wiese. Scratch the surface of an explorer and you'll find an adventure and a great story. This show is about their tales. This podcast is a proud supporter of the Explorers Club and the EC50 Initiative, 50 people changing the world that the world needs to know about. For more information, go to explorers.org. There's a tradition of the explorer, and that's the role of a storyteller. And I have a theory that since the beginning of humankind, there's always been one intrepid individual who would venture across the horizon and come back, stand over a fire and say, "You'll never guess what I saw. You'll never guess what happened to me." Our guest today is U.S. National Park Ranger Shelton Johnson, and as you will soon hear, has followed that tradition. You may recognize him from the Ken Burns documentary, National Parks, America's Best Secret. Welcome to the show, Shelton.
Richard, it's a pleasure being on the show. Thank you for having me.
I was just talking about that idea of storytellers over fires. And I think that as an American, one of my strongest images is that of people around a campfire telling stories.
Yeah.
I know as a park ranger, you've really gotten to see a very varied audience of people experience the outdoors. But there's one camping guest that you had that really, I've heard stories about space and people going to the bottom of the ocean, but you actually went camping with Oprah.
Yeah. I invited her to Yosemite, and her people decided that what would be better than surprising Ranger Shelton? I don't think she was thinking of the medical implications of surprising me. I didn't have a coronary, but I think I might have been close. But I basically disguised my state of shock when she suddenly appeared along with Gail King at the South entrance. But, it's one of those things where, Christmas is not supposed to come except on December 25th, but it really felt like a celebratory event when suddenly Gail and Oprah were approaching me at the South entrance. And she brought her entire crew. So the Oprah Winfrey Show was with her. So yeah, I was in a state of shock, but it was also that moment of recognizing that a dream that I have had for years was about to come true. I wanted to magnify and amplify the Buffalo Soldier history, the story of African-Americans stewarding the second and third oldest national parks in the country. And so having Oprah in front of me was a means of communicating that to my own people, to not just my own people, but to all people, because her show was the #1 talk show on planet Earth. So all of that was pressurized in that moment. And that was the light in my eyes that was shock, awe, but also just a sense of being blessed that she was present in front of me.
About 20 years ago, I was invited to a small dinner in New York City, and it was just 5 people and Oprah. And I was pleasantly surprised. I thought she was a really amazing person. But I would think in a camping situation, she doesn't travel light and she doesn't travel without a lot of other people. So that had to be a little bit different. And I'm sure your colleagues in the parks department there at Yosemite probably said, what is she like? What was she like camping and all that other stuff? What was your favorite sort of Oprah moment there?
Well, there were several, but the key thing is that she had never been camping before. So Yosemite was not only her first camping trip, it was also her first visit to any national park in the world. So she was not accustomed to this whole experience of being really in the outdoors. And it was an interesting thing to be an observer, to see how she was negotiating this very new terrain for her. Because for her, this was a wilderness experience. For people who regularly venture into the national parks and wilderness areas around the world, wilderness means a completely different thing. They're thinking Bhutan, they're thinking the Himalaya, they're thinking all of these other places, the outback in Australia. But for someone who is very urban and urbane, the experience of being in Yosemite was as remote. It was the dark side of the moon, but she negotiated it. She was having fun with it. Gail was having fun with it. And I have to say that one of my greatest memories was being in the car with Oprah and Gail, and we're driving towards Yosemite Valley. And I'm hearing off in the distance a helicopter. And I'm wondering, what's that sound from? And I looked up and I said, hey guys, there's a helicopter overhead. And without missing a beat, Oprah was at the wheel drive and she said, oh, don't worry, it's mine. So her
What?
helicopter was
That is
flying over our
crazy.
SUV and filming us as we were going. And then later, when the show was broadcast, I saw that scene of the SUV, and I'm thinking, I'm in that SUV, and that's how that was my introduction to that level of Hollywood, where I didn't even know I was in a scene of a movie, but I was in the scene of a television show.
But that's a great story. But I guess, to me, it's life sometimes is stranger than fiction. And I once read a quote from you, and because you've been a very prominent speaker in the national parks, I know that you actually went to the screening of Ken Burns' film in the White House, which is a whole other question. But someone once asked you why you did not seek a promotion or higher pay. And this is what the quote you said is, I facilitate astonishment. I didn't join the park service for money. I get paid in gasps. And I'm sure there's such satisfaction. Forget about Oprah. I mean, that would be fun for sure. But when you have a carload of 9 or 10-year-olds coming there for the first time and you get the wow moment, that has got to be a great feeling.
It's better than any paycheck. It's better than any inheritance. When you bring someone into this environment, these environments, our national parks, the protected areas around the world, and when you have young people who could not have even imagined that places such as Yosemite or Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon or national parks throughout the world existed, and to see that look of awe, and of course that word is rooted in the same word for fear, but fear is a mechanism that wakes up the mind, it wakes up the spirit and the soul, and really what it means is that you are literally, all that is human within you is displayed through that look, through that gaze. And that's what I live for, are those moments when you can see young people who could not even imagine a place like Yosemite Falls or Yosemite and Yosemite Falls existed. And they're watching it. They're watching the highest waterfalls in North America flow in front of them. And maybe they spent their lives reading about Hogwarts and the Harry Potter books. And the thing that I've always tried to communicate is that there are so many wondrous, magical places in the world, and they're real. They're real. And when you're in Yosemite Valley and you see the highest waterfalls in North America, when you're in Yellowstone, you're walking through the Upper Geyser Basin. When I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa, and I remember taking this midnight bath outside in the rainforest during a full moon with all of these birds and animals just making their individual noises, this cacophony that was surrounding me, I felt I had been thrust back to the beginning of humanity itself. And it was a baptism. But it was a baptism that was a secular one, but it was yet sacred at the same time. That's what I live for. I live to see those kids wake up for the first time in their lives in the presence of something that's divine.
Our mission is to empower the next generation of explorers. If you like this podcast, please recommend it to a friend and have them join the expedition. You mentioned just briefly Buffalo Soldiers, and that's a term or a piece of history that most Americans have never heard of. And I think, as most historians will say, it's so important to really explain history, because really it tells you where you've come from and really the roadmap of where you're going. How does the story of the Buffalo Soldier, turn of the 20th century, really unfold?
Well, the thing that's so powerful about it, specifically and particularly for African Americans, is imagine you find yourself, and you have done this, you find yourself in another nation. You're in another country, you're in another part of the world, different language, different customs, different culture. And then you get invited to someone's home. And when you get to that home, the door opens and it's your family, it's your mother, it's your father, it's maybe your brother, your sister. They're there behind that door. Here you are in a completely foreign, unfamiliar environment, but family opens the door. That's what happens when you are African American. You venture out into the unknown, you visit a national park, and you find a history that tells you that you've arrived where you started. You're almost quoting T.S. Eliot, when you arrive literally at your own home. And that is a powerful engagement when what appeared to be foreign is familiar. Not only familiar, it's family.
So the story of the Buffalo Soldiers, these were, and again, I've heard you speak. If anybody has the opportunity to see Shelton on YouTube, I think it was a Black History Month from last year or the year before, and you were talking about the history of the Buffalo Soldier. It is really worth hearing. It is one of the best extemporaneous talks for 16 minutes without any stumbles, ahs, and just pure enthusiasm. So we don't have 16 minutes to hear about the Buffalo Soldier, but for people listening to this, what is a Buffalo Soldier? Where were they? Why is it important? Why does it matter?
Yeah. Buffalo Soldiers were African American cavalry and infantry troops or regiments that were formed in the 1860s, just after the Civil War. It's important to keep in mind that the United States military was segregated up until 1948, when President Truman, passed an executive order ending segregation in the military. And so these troops, when they served during the Indian Wars, their Plains Indian protagonists, when they were close in hand-to-hand combat, they saw that the hair on their head was just like the matted cushion between the horns of the buffalo. And then in the Dakotas, these African-American soldiers sometimes would start wearing literally coats made out of the fur, the hide of a buffalo. And so you couldn't tell where the buffalo ended and the African-American began. And because of all those similarities, a lot of the Plains Indians began to call them Buffalo Soldiers, and considering that the buffalo was the heart of Plains Indian cultures, that was a great compliment. And these African-American soldiers took it as a great compliment, but they didn't think of themselves necessarily as Buffalo Soldiers. They were 24th or 25th regiments of infantry. They were the 9th or 10th regiments of cavalry. That's how they saw themselves. But this other name took on a life of its own. And of course, think of it this way. This history is so important that a guy in Jamaica by the name of Bob Marley, that story so resonated with him that he created a song called Buffalo Soldier. So it's not just something that's just specific to the United States. It has everything to do with the African diaspora and Africans in America, not African Americans, but Africans in America finding something to celebrate that was a positive, as opposed to a history that was very much a negative. And I mean slavery, I mean the period of Jim Crow, all of those things. So these are guys that should be wearing capes and spandex. They should be flying through the air, because what they did was heroic, but at a terrible cost, because you have indigenous people at war with indigenous people of African descent fighting the indigenous Native Americans. And the two groups that had the most in common in terms of outlook, cultural perspectives, were the two groups who were at odds with each other because of this whole nature of America becoming America at that time.
So if someone were to, say, climb to the top of Mount Whitney, that's the highest mountain in the lower 48s, or come into Yosemite, would they be walking on the path that was actually created by these people back in 1904 or 5? I don't know the exact years, but are there remnants of this?
1903 is when Charles Young, Captain Charles Young, the third African-American to graduate from West Point, was the acting military superintendent of Sequoia National Park. And that was also the year that the first trail was built to the top of Mount Whitney, which at that time was the highest mountain in the United States, because Alaska wasn't a state at that point. So that's a great achievement, because when you think about the history of mountaineering, you don't normally think of figures that are African American. But here are these African American soldiers who were not trained to do this work. But one thing that's important to keep in mind, West Point was the greatest school of engineering in the United States at that time in the 19th century. So it makes perfect sense that the military was invested in building infrastructure in these fledgling national parks. Who else would have the skill set to build a road, to build buildings, to build a town in the middle of the wild? So why not build a trail to the top of the highest mountain? And that's what they did in 1903.
Shelton, I know you're an advocate for bringing minorities, particularly African Americans, to the park system. And how do you, first of all, get them there? Because to be honest, I don't see a lot of them in national parks, more so than in the past. I can say that. And then how do you convince them that they own this park as much as I do, you do, as much as the president does? What is the pitch?
Well, the pitch is that when you talk to African Americans today, they are African Americans. But at one time, 100, 200 years ago, we were all Africans in America. We were all indigenous people to various nations throughout Africa. And so when you return as an African American to the wild, you may not be returning specifically to Africa, but you are returning to the earth. You're returning to that sense of indigenous rootedness to the land, to the sky, and all the space in between. So I always argue that any African American that goes into the wild is going to Africa. Because if you and I, right now, if we were standing in the Sea of Tranquility on the moon, like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, who are Explorer members, right? Or were Explorer members.
They are.
They are. You could look up and see the earth. And from that view, there are no nations. From that view, you can't see roads or streets or cities. All you see is the biosphere. All you see are clouds. All you see is the light of that is sacred, that has no equal, as far as we know, anywhere in the known universe. And you would have been, and I would be in awe at what we're seeing. And so that's the point right there, is that the wild is not just specific to Africa. The wild is the earth itself. So African Americans can find Africa, reconnect with Africa in our national parks. It's the same place.
So you have made the point numerous times, I've heard, that the best reality show going on is really outside. It's not on your smartphone or iPad or any other device. Describe a moment in Yosemite, and this probably happens often, where there is magic in the air.
In Yosemite, in the spring, right now, during the full moon, there is a phenomenon called the lunar rainbow, which occurs in the spray of Lower Yosemite Fall, which is part of Yosemite Falls, which is the 5th highest waterfalls in the world. You can walk to the base of a waterfall, this waterfall, during the full moon and see a lunar rainbow in the spray of Lower Yosemite Fall. Now, you can get into the science of it. You can talk about the vapor of the water, the spray, how it works as a prism, how it breaks up visible light into all the different constituents. But that's a boring way to describe wonder, to describe magic. You don't have to go to Hogwarts. You don't have to go to Middle Earth. That sense of the divine, that sense of spiritual magic is right there, and it's a reality. And when you're at the base of the Lower Yosemite Fall and you see that rainbow form, you know that there's a higher power in this world, and you are in its presence. And whatever name it may be, it's in color, and it is iridescent, and it is lighting up itself, and it's lighting you up at the same time.
I'm getting ready to pack the car with the kids and come over, but I have, admittedly, I'm not what I consider a religious person, but there have been times when I stand outside, and probably the most spectacular things I've ever seen are a full solar eclipse, beyond crazy. You know, I can see why people thought the world was ending. But the other thing is, if you've ever seen an aurora borealis, it is lights dancing out there. I mean, goosebumps you get from seeing that stuff. And I think that people feel, okay, I can't go up to a northern climate to see that, but there's so many things of majesty. And I think the descriptive you've used is a tree. Like, you're from Detroit originally. You might contextualize a tree differently in an urban area where it's planted around concrete versus going out in a grove of trees. Care to elaborate on that?
Well, think of it this way. Most people that live in urban areas don't think that when they're in the presence of a tree, they're in the presence of something that's divine. I mean, that is greater than they are. When you think of like Icelandic myths and so forth, you know, what was that, Yggdrasil? You think of the tree as like the symbolic of the cosmos itself. Well, when you're in the presence of the gentle Sherman tree, the largest sequoia in the world and the largest tree in the world by volume of wood, a tree that has a branch that's greater in diameter than any tree east of the Mississippi River. So it's a tree, a gigantic tree that has an immense branch that's larger than any tree east of the Mississippi. You know you're in the presence of something that is much greater than anything that human beings could even conceive of or imagine themselves to become. And you are left speechless, as we all should, because in that speechless moment, that's where God or spirit comes in, because that's where the sacred is always found. It is found in silence. And that's what I loved about being a tour guide, if you will, a ranger in Lehman Cave in Great Basin National Park, because as you know, it's just as quiet in a cave as it is outside if you're in the middle of the Great Basin Desert. And I find that same sense of the sacred in the presence of anything that reminds human beings that we're really a small, very small, infinitesimally tiny part of the universe. And that's what a giant sequoia is there for, I think, to some degree. It is there to give us and restore humility. We don't have enough humility, and we need to have that in order to survive.
You know, I have to ask you two questions before we leave. And one is that I know that you watched the movie Ken Burns' documentary with President Obama. And again, here's a guy who's, you know, very mired in politics, industry, all that other stuff. What was his sense of it? He never struck me as always being outside. I get the feeling he probably would like to be more outside. Was there a seminal moment there that you sort of had him go, I've got to check this out?
Oh, yeah. I can tell you the seminal moment. I was actually asked to accompany President Obama up to Vernal Fall.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I'm walking with, it's not just President Obama, it was President Obama, and it was the first family. They're all walking up to Vernal Fall. And then the first thing I noticed was that President Obama is in pretty good shape. I mean, I had to run ahead of him, of the group, to be there as the ranger who's posted when they arrived. And when President Obama arrived at the top of Vernal Fall, he barely seemed to even have, like he had went through the makeup department. There was no beading sweat or anything. He just looked like himself.
Are
So
we
he's
talking about a unicorn or are we talking about Obama?
We're talking about Obama. So he's standing there, and I felt that this was the moment I can give my pitch. I could thank him for creating the Charles Young Buffalo Soldier National Monument. I could tell him that, remember me? I worked with Ken Burns. I was there at the White House, and we talked about the national parks. You told me a story about your grandmother and you being with her in Yellowstone, and this bison that you were walking to, and her yelling at you, saying, boy, get away from that. So anyway, the point is, I was going to tell him all this stuff. But when I looked in his face, all I could see was that look of awe that and that I know. And he was looking at it, and he was a part of the world around him. He was immersed in it, and there was no separation between Obama and the range of light. And I realized that was not the moment to pitch something to him. That was his moment to be in Yosemite, and for Yosemite to be in him. So I let him alone, and I let him have his moment in Yosemite.
But I think you just described, and this was going to be my last question, that national parks are America's best secret, that you can have a head of state, you can have a queen, you could have Oprah, you could have anybody, but you could also have a young kid from Detroit or New York City or from Miami. Any of those people are looking at that same spot, the same view, and have the freedom to experience that moment of awe.
Yeah. And what you're describing is this young man, African-American. He was just a kid. It was his first trip to Yosemite. And like I said, we were at the base of Lower Yosemite Fall. It was not at night, but he was just seeing that fall for the first time, the highest waterfalls in North America. And we kept walking closer, but he just was transfixed when he first had that image of what was before him. And I turned around, I went back to him, and I said, hey, are you all right? Is everything okay? And he didn't even look at me. He just kept looking at the falls, and he said, and I quote, I just had no idea that such beauty existed. And so the point that I'm making is this: that in the dominant culture, there's this perception that maybe people of color, maybe African Americans, cannot connect with these environments. And what I found is the exact opposite. Those people who have not been baptized in these environments are much more likely to have a transcendent moment in the presence of these places, because there's been no buildup. They've gone from asphalt, they've gone from concrete and steel, they've gone from an urban environment, and suddenly they're in the presence of all that is holy in this world. And you can see it in their face. You can see it like when you look at Rembrandt, those paintings, and you see that look of rapture, that light that's coming from them. I've seen it in the faces of these African Americans and Hispanics and who did not know these environments belonged to them, and that there was something sacred on this earth that you could just pay a fee and walk in and experience God.
Shelton, I hope I have the opportunity to stand by one of those falls. I'm not Oprah, I'm not President Obama, but I think you'll get a lot of oohs and ahs and wows out of me. Shelton, thank you so much for sharing this. And I think maybe you're America's best kept secret.
I like being a secret. It makes it easier to go shopping.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed our podcast. Now we have a little favor to ask. We'd really appreciate your support, so make sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button so you'll never miss another episode. See you out on the trail.